Well, good morning. It's great to see everyone here. If you would like a translation of the service, please use the QR code that will be shown in a moment, and you'll be able to access one via that. And if you haven't got a Bible yet and you would like one, please do put up your hand, and one will be brought to you. And if you're using a church Bible, we are back on page 835, and we are looking at Matthew 28 and verses 1 to 10. And there are no sermon such prizes to give out this morning. And as we look at Matthew 28 and verses 1 to 10 this morning, we are going to be focusing on the two Marys. We're going to be focusing on Mary Magdalene, and we're going to be focusing on the other Mary, the Mary who was the mother of James and Joseph. And as we walk with them to the tomb, and as we see what they see, and as we hear what they hear, and as we watch how they respond to the different events at this Resurrection Sunday, it is my prayer that being with them and experiencing it with them, it would help us to be filled with a great sense of wonder and thankfulness and awe at Jesus and the fact that Jesus is alive and that Jesus has risen from the dead. Now, Jesus has been crucified. That has happened on the Friday, and Joseph of Arimathea with Nicodemus has taken his body down from the cross and have carried him to his tomb and has laid him in the tomb, and then has rolled a stone across the entrance. And this stone wouldn't have been a random boulder that was just kicking about, but it would have been a stone that was specially shaped so that it slotted into a groove and rolled into place, blocking the entrance. And it would have been designed to have been easy to roll into place, but quite difficult to roll away from the entrance. It's now very early on the Sunday morning, verse 1. And these two Marys are on their way to the tomb. We know from the other gospel accounts that when the Sabbath had finished, which would have happened at nightfall, these two Marys would have rushed off to the shops to go and buy some spices so that they could anoint Jesus' body. We also know from the other gospel accounts that on the Sunday, they are carrying the spices with the intention of anointing Jesus' body when they reach the tomb. And yet you notice that when you look at verse 1, that's not Matthew's focus here. And Matthew doesn't mention the spices, and Matthew doesn't mention their intention to anoint Jesus' body. He tells us that they went to see Jesus' tomb, verse 1. They went to see the tomb. You remember back in chapter 27 and verse 61, on the Friday when the body of Jesus had been laid in the tomb, these two Marys who had gone to the tomb and seen the body being laid in the tomb and then watched as the stone was rolled into place and then everyone else went away, these two Marys, they stayed there sitting opposite the tomb, presumably looking at it. And now early on the Sunday morning, they've come back to the tomb to do the same. They've come back to the tomb to see it. Clearly, they are devoted to Jesus. And as they walk to the tomb, and you picture them in your imagination, I wonder what they're talking about. As you overhear them, what are they saying? We know from Mark's Gospel that at one point, as they walk, they discuss who is going to roll the stone away from us, for us. But what else did they say? What did they say to each other? Did they share memories with each other about Jesus and what Jesus had done for them? Did they talk about how Jesus meant so much to them? Did they go through in detail, in order, all of the horrific events and the things that had been done to Jesus on the Friday? Did they keep saying to each other, I just don't understand it. I wasn't expecting it. I can't even believe that it's happened, that he's gone, that he's dead. Did they walk in profound silence, not able to say anything at all? Did they worry about the future, and did they talk together about the future? After all, if Jesus, their leader, was treated like this and has been crucified, then what's going to happen to his group of disciples? And what's going to happen to them, these two followers of Jesus? Now, some suggest that these two women weren't at the tomb to witness what happened next in verses 2 to 4. And they suggest that verses 2 to 4, they are included to explain the scene that greeted them when they did arrive at the tomb. But that doesn't seem to be the natural reading of the text. No, the natural reading of the text is that they were there. And on arriving at the tomb, suddenly there was a great earthquake, verse 2. And a dazzling angel of the Lord comes down from heaven and rolls back the stone and sits on it. Now, in Luke and John's account, we read about two angels rather than one. And so you say, well, why the difference? Why the difference between their accounts and Matthew's account? And why is it not always easy to harmonize the resurrection accounts in the Gospels? Does that cast some doubt on their trustworthiness? Well, no, actually, it's very assuring that it's not always straightforward to harmonize all the details, because clearly it shows that Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, they didn't get in a room together and make sure that they got their stories straight. In a court of law, their testimonies would have been seen as being much more reliable than four accounts all repeating the same thing word for word. If you were to read a news story today using a variety of news platforms, that same news story would appear very differently across those news platforms, because those different news platforms, they are looking to present that piece of news with a certain focus. They're coming at it from their own angle. And that's exactly what happens in the Gospels. All of the Gospels, they have their own particular focus and they have their own angle. And their accounts of the resurrection are told from that focus. And it's not that Matthew says that there was only one angel. He only tells us about one angel. When these women reached the tomb, suddenly there was a great earthquake, verse 2. If you look back in chapter 27 and verse 51, when Jesus died, there was an earthquake. And now when this angel appears at the place of his resurrection, there is another earthquake. You know, in Jesus' death and resurrection, everything is shaken. Everything that you thought was certain and permanent, everything is shaken. The whole old world order as we know it, it's turned upside down. The grave has been defeated. Satan has been beaten. Salvation is available, and final judgment is coming. Jesus' death and resurrection, it's shaken everything. Now, angels are often involved in significant events in the Bible, for example, in the giving of the law, or the announcing of Jesus' birth, or his ascension into heaven. And here at his grave, this angel descends from heaven, and there is a great earthquake. Earthquakes are often signs in the Bible of God's wrath and terror and judgment. And yet you notice how the angel comforts these two Marys as he says to the two women, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified." You know, if you are a friend of the crucified Jesus, then when it comes to the terror and the wrath and the anger and the judgment of God, you have nothing to be afraid of. If you are a friend of the crucified Jesus, then when it comes to the wrath and the anger and the terror and the judgment of God, you have nothing to be afraid of. And the angel said to the two Marys, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you seek Jesus who was crucified. He is not here, for he has risen." What amazing news! What mind-boggling news! What an unexpected turn of events. Don't get too familiar with this. Don't allow the familiarity of this story dull your sense of wonder at what this angel is saying. For example, when was the last time that you went to go and lay flowers on someone's grave and someone told you that the person was no longer there? When was the last time that happened? Come and talk to me afterwards if it has. And if it did happen, think about how you would feel. And think about the questions that would tumble out of your mouth when you were told that. Questions like, well, where are they then? What have you done with them? Where have you put them? Oh, they've come back to life again. What are you talking about? He is not here, for he has risen. These two women were there at Calvary on the Friday at the cross. We know that. They'd seen him be nailed to the cross. They'd seen that cross be lifted up from the ground. They'd heard his cries of agony. They saw when he died. They watched as a Roman soldier took a spear and thrust it into his side to make sure that he was really dead. They were there when Joseph and Nicodemus took the body down from the cross. And then they followed them as they carried that body to the tomb. They saw where the body was laid. They watched as the stone was rolled in front of the entrance to the tomb. And then when everyone else went away, these two Marys stayed there sitting, watching the tomb, looking at it. They knew that Jesus was dead. And now they are being told that Jesus has come back to life. What must have been going through their mind? Now notice the evidence that the angel points to establish the fact of Jesus' resurrection. Firstly, the angel says he has risen as he said he would, verse 6. As he said he would. Again and again, Jesus had told them about his resurrection. He'd explained the manner in which he would be killed, and then he shared with them, but I'm going to rise on the third day. So, for example, you think back to Matthew chapter 16. And when Jesus had asked his disciples, who are people saying that I am? And the disciples say, well, some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, but others say Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And Jesus says, but who do you say that I am? And Peter says, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And it was from that time that Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed, and on the third day be raised. If you were to look in chapter 17 and verses 22 and 23, he tells them again. And if you were to look in chapter 20 and verses 17 to 19, you will see that he tells them again. And if you were to carry on reading, you were to see that he tells them again and again in different ways. And on being prompted by the angel, their memory of Jesus telling his disciples this again and again and again would have come back into these women's minds. And they must have gone, oh yeah, he did tell us this. Secondly, notice how the angel points to the evidence of the empty tomb. He says in verse 6, come and see where he lay. Come and see where he lay. He invites them into the tomb. Presumably they go in and they see that Jesus is not where he had been laid. And maybe they look around and they see Jesus is not anywhere in the tomb. The tomb is empty. You know, the reason why the angel came to move the stone was not to let Jesus out. It was to let the witnesses in. It was to let these women verify that the tomb was empty. The angel says, "Come see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples that he has risen from the dead, and behold, he's going before you to Galilee. There you will see him." Having seen that the tomb was empty, the angel tells them to go quickly and tell the disciples that he has risen from the dead. Why go quickly? Well, because this is the most amazing news that they are going to hear in their lives. And listen, the angel says, tell them that Jesus is going to meet you in Galilee and that there you will see him. You remember back after the Passover meal in chapter 26 and verse 31, where Jesus said to them, "You will all fall away because of me this night. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to where? To Galilee." And if you look in verse 16, you will see that he met them in Galilee. He meets them in Jerusalem as well. He meets them in other places, but he meets them also in Galilee. And the angel finishes in verse 7 by saying, "See, I have told you." Third piece of evidence for the resurrection for these women, the testimony of this angel. An angel has appeared. And this angel has told them that Jesus has risen from the dead. Not something that happens every day, is it? Not to me anyway. And if these women don't believe an angel, then who are they going to believe? Do you believe that Jesus has risen from the dead? Yes or no? If no, can I encourage you to investigate? Can I encourage you to explore the facts? Can I encourage you to look into it? Because if Jesus has risen from the dead, which he has, then that is a game changer. That changes everything. That changes how you see everything in your life and in this world. That changes how you look at life, and that changes how you look at death. And that changes how you see eternity. These women, they haven't even seen Jesus yet, and they are convinced that he has risen from the dead. And so, verse 8, they departed quickly from the tomb with fear and great joy, and they ran to tell his disciples. They ran. They pegged it. They raced each other. Who was the faster runner, do you think? Do you think it was Mary? Or do you think it was Mary? I think it was Mary. They left the tomb quickly and they ran. Why? Because this is the best news they've ever heard. And this is the best news the disciples are ever going to hear. And you notice how they are feeling in verse 8. They have fear, they are afraid, and yet at the same time, they have great joy. I mean, you would, wouldn't you? And this is the most unreal, real thing that would have happened to them. Heaven has broken in on their world, and their lives have been turned upside down. You think of what it says in Psalm 2 and verse 11. Serve the Lord with fear and rejoice with trembling. Rejoice in what here? That King Jesus, the Lord's anointed, the Messiah, who was conspired against and put to death, is alive again. They have amazing news to tell, and they are running to tell the disciples. And look, verse 9, as they are running, Jesus himself meets them. Before they get to the disciples, Jesus gets to them. How amazing is this? How did it happen? Picture the scene in your mind. Did Jesus stand on their route at some point in the distance? And as they were running, they suddenly saw him in the distance, and so they sped up to go and see him. Or did Jesus just suddenly appear and they shot straight past him and had to double back round again? Here's the fourth piece of evidence for him. They saw him. They actually saw him. They didn't just have the memory of his prophecies or the evidence of the empty tomb or the testimony of an angel. They saw the risen Jesus with their own eyes. What does Jesus say to them? Well, he uses a very ordinary word for hello. He says, greetings. Work this through in your mind. This is just incredible. So Jesus has risen from the dead. He has come back from the grave. He's standing there right in front of them. And what does Jesus say to them? Morning. Hi. Hello. How are you? How ordinary. In spite of such extraordinary events, how ordinary. And yet they don't think that he's ordinary, do they? Verse 9. They take hold of his feet and they worship him. Notice how physical Jesus is. It wasn't that they saw a glimpse of Jesus from a distance, some shadowy, ethereal figure, and they kind of think they saw him, it looked like it, but they're not quite sure. No, they took hold of his feet. Jesus was tangible. He was physical. He had substance. He was made out of flesh and bones. He had bodily risen. And you too, after death, will bodily rise. And if you are a friend of Jesus who was crucified, you will rise to eternal life. Now, what do you have to do to take hold of someone's feet and worship them? You have to fall to the ground. And in our spiritual dullness this morning, let the response of these women enliven our senses. They took hold of his feet and they worshipped him. Him who they saw to be so great and themselves who they saw to be so lowly that the most that they could do was to take hold of his feet. His feet that had been pierced by nails. Maybe that was why, in part, they wanted to clasp hold of his feet. That his feet had been pierced by nails. Those feet that had carried him about as he went around doing good, telling people the good news of the kingdom, giving sight to the blind and hearing to the deaf, and reaching out his hand and touching an unclean leper, and feeding the hungry and helping the poor and comforting the hurting. Of all the people to crucify, they crucified him. Now, why did Jesus appear to these women as they ran to tell the disciples the good news? Or was it to give them further assurance that he was really alive? Yes, I think that's a massive part of it. And how much more joy must they have felt to have seen him with their own eyes, that he really was alive. But I also think that Jesus appeared to these women simply because he wanted to see them. And he wanted to be with them. He loved them, these women who clearly loved him. And I think that it was their devotion in going to see his tomb early on the Sunday morning. I think that that was partly behind him wanting to meet them here. You know, Jesus, he loves to reveal his glory to those who want to see him. These women, they went down to his tomb with the intention of seeing the tomb, and they end up seeing his wonderful face. And they came up and took hold of his feet and worshipped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers to go to Galilee, and there they will see me. Again, they are encouraged not to be afraid, but to go and tell the disciples the good news and to tell them to go to Galilee where they would see him. And you notice how Jesus refers to his disciples in verse 10. So if you look in verse 7, the angel refers to his disciples, as pupils, as students, as learners of Jesus. But Jesus calls them my brothers, my family. How amazing is that? That he should call them his brothers. When one of them denied him and the rest of them abandoned him. You remember Psalm 22 from last week and how it prophesied of the risen Jesus holding a feast for his brothers and his family and telling them what great things he has done. And though we saw that Hebrews 2 takes hold of that and applies it to the New Testament church meeting to worship, isn't that something of what's going on here? Isn't that something of what Jesus is going to do here? He's going to meet with them. He's going to meet with his brothers. He's going to meet with his family. And they're going to see him. And he's going to tell them the great things that God has done for him. I mean, just standing there physically in front of them, having been dead but now being alive again, that in and of itself is going to tell them what great things God has done. He's going to go through the Old Testament scriptures. And he's going to show them what great things the Lord has done for him in showing how this was always spoken about. His suffering and his death and his resurrection. He's going to meet with them. He's going to tell them what great things God has done for him. And he's even going to eat and drink with them. You think in Acts 10 when Peter goes to Cornelius' house and he says that we were witnesses of the risen Jesus, and he says we even ate and drank with him after he rose from the dead. And you've got those different occasions in the Gospels where that happened. So for example in Luke 24, Jesus took fish and ate it in front of them. Even better in John 21, Jesus cooked breakfast for them on the beach. You see, they are his family in spite of the way in which they've treated him. And you say, how gracious Jesus is. How hopeful this is for us here this morning. How wonderful is his loving death, and how glorious is his resurrection and all that it has achieved. They're going to see him. They've got this prospect. They're going to see him. And you know, if Jesus is your brother, and if you love Jesus, and if you are a friend of Jesus who was crucified, you one day are going to see him as well. You're going to see the Christ. You're going to see the risen King. You're going to see your elder brother. You're going to see the one into whose family you have been adopted, and you're going to fall at his feet, and you are going to worship him. The snooker tournament, the Champion of Champions, was played in Coventry in 2019 in what was the Ricoh Arena at the time. And I managed to get a ticket for the opening afternoon. I mean, who wouldn't? And there were two matches scheduled for that afternoon, and one was going to be played after the other, so you got to see them both. The first was Neil Robertson v Martin Gould, and the second was Sean Murphy, who is there, v Rhian Evans. Well, while we were watching the first match between Neil Robertson and Martin Gould, between one of the games, the man that was sitting next to me, he said to me, "Do you know any professional snooker players personally?" And I said, "No." He said, "I know Sean Murphy." I said, "Oh." A little bit later, he said, "How much was your ticket to get in here?" And I said it was only £11, feeling quite pleased that it was quite cheap. And he proudly felt the lanyard around his neck with his pass on it and said, "Sean Murphy gave me this." It's nice. A little bit later, he said, "What are you doing after the match?" I said, I'm having dinner with friends." He said, "I'm having dinner with Sean Murphy." And on it went. Anyway, it got to the end of the match, and there was a bit of a break between that and the Sean Murphy match, and I thought, I need to find another seat. I can't sit next to the Sean Murphy match with this man. And so I looked for an empty seat, and I found a seat where no one was sitting. And so I went and sat down and started to relax and look forward to the Sean Murphy match, when my new neighbour leaned in. And he said, "Do you play snooker?" I said, "Sometimes, but very badly." I said, "You?" He nodded towards the table and said, "I've played Sean Murphy." Fast forward a couple of years, and Joel and Siobhan Willis and their family start attending here. And for some reason, this comes up in a conversation with Joel, and I tell him my little story, and he started to laugh, and he said, "You'll never guess what." I said, "What?" He said, "Sean Murphy used to go to my church youth group." I said, "Am I the only person in the world who doesn't know Sean Murphy?" Well, I don't know Sean Murphy, but I do know Jesus, the risen King. And it's not just that I know him, he is my elder brother. And I am his little brother. And one day I'm going to see him. One day I'm going to be with him. And what kind of blows my mind is not just that I am looking forward to seeing him and being with him, but he is looking forward to being with me. Because he rose from the dead, I'm going to rise from the dead as well. And I'm going to live forever with Jesus, the risen King, my elder brother. And what am I? What are we to be doing as we wait for that day when we will see Jesus? We are to be like these women in these verses. And we are to be so excitedly wanting to tell people about the fact that Jesus has risen from the dead. Jesus, he tells us that at the end of the chapter. That's what we are to be doing. And we are to be telling people the best news that they can ever hear, that Jesus has risen from the dead, and people can have eternal life in his name. And it's not just that they can know the risen King, but they can be in his family, and he can be their brother. Let's